Welcome back, old timers, and welcome newcomers. I'm Andy Norman. This is Examined Lives, where this is a forum where we explore life's big questions and try to apply some Darwinian view of life to gain a deeper understanding of, among other things, the human condition. I wanted to remind you that we're committed to a form of engagement that builds community and that mostly precludes sort of long speeches. I want lots of small, shiny contributions that add up to a rich mosaic of perspectives. You can contribute by helping to by sharing the floor and try to offer sort of one quick hit observation per turn is ideal. Okay, and we're going to try to, over previous weeks, we've been driving down sort of the average length of a given contribution from several minutes down, closer and closer to 1 minute. And I'd like to see if we can get it down to about 30 seconds. I think a certain vitality kicks in at some point, and you can, if you can help us reach that goal, that would be great.
Well, okay. Apparently brevity is a sacred value of this group.
Ah, very good. That's right. And we can even discuss we can even discuss the downsides of that if you wish. But so I'm going to take a few minutes just to set the table and offer a short introduction to the topic. So for a long time, I thought that religious people had sacred values and secular people like me don't. And I've also thought, in addition, that it's not a particularly good idea to sacralize things because sacralization tends to induce rigidity and intransigence. It's been my attitude for much of my life. But I've learned more recently that scholars who think deeply about this define the concept in a way that crosses a line between religious and secular. In particular, I think the prevailing scholarly concept is a sacred thing is something that's too important to be traded off against merely instrumental or things. So I'm going to offer a few examples. You might have been brought up to think that your belief in God is sacred, that must be protected at almost all costs, and that therefore compromising your faith is too steep a price to pay, no matter what's at stake. You might think that human rights deserve to be treated as sacred. After all, the whole point of a right is that it's something that is important enough that you shouldn't trade off one person's right for the greater well-being of us all, for example. So you can't just enslave 2% of the population to provide greater overall happiness for society as a whole. I imagine that there are what sociologists call honor cultures, or anthropologists call honor cultures, where your honor or your reputation is treated as something too sacred to compromise. And of course, there's an extremely mundane example that I think all of us can relate to. I don't think any one of us would sell a son or a daughter, no matter how exorbitant the asking price. In fact, most of us would probably find the mere suggestion that we do so offensive. And that would fall under the category of sacred values, the way scholars are defining it now, which means that none of us are immune to sacralizing things. So part of the fun, I think, is to actually see how many examples of sacred values we can generate. So although I have several more, I hope to bring into the conversation. I want to move quickly to a point and invite you to identify phenomena that seem to fall under this category. So I'm going to pose a couple questions, but while I'm doing that, you might want to jot down an example or two of something that our culture or maybe a subculture treats as sacred. just so that we can have a nice stock of examples with which to think. So some questions that I hope will animate our conversation today. What aspects of our lives are touched by sacred values? Why do we feel a need to sacralize anything? Is it a good thing or a bad thing that we tend to sacralize? How do we avoid over-sacralizing or sacralizing things we shouldn't? And how do we avoid under-sacralizing or failing to sacralize things we should? And how do you conduct fruitful negotiations when the parties involved have different ideas about what's sacred? All right, enough of stage setting. Let's get to it. I'd like, especially at the outset here, to have people just offer up a few examples of the phenomenon, and then we can begin to sort of discuss the issues. Does anybody, Hank, have you got one for us?
Well, I don't have one, but I just want to add, being a psychoanalyst, I'll think about the unconscious. And I'm not sure many people, I see this in the clinical room all the time, what people consider sacred values, they may not be significantly aware of it. And so some of the work is just, like Freud said, bringing the unconscious to the conscious or something like that. So I just want to suggest we keep that in mind, even though it doesn't have to, because it has to do with world events too, not just in a clinical setting. So that's the only part.
And one thing I'm hearing Hank observe is that you can sacralize something subconsciously.
Yeah.
Or just unthinkingly buy into a larger culture's tendency to sacralize something. Very good. We have a small enough group here so far that just waving in the window might be a good way to ask for a chance to speak. I hear you, I see you, John, and Sage. I got you too. If our numbers swell or if it gets unmanageable, we'll use the electronic hand raising technique to form a turn queue. So David, talk to us.
I was just going to mention what I think is an obvious one. I don't know, maybe it was already mentioned. I was kind of tending to an email as we began, but individualism comes up in our discussions, and I've been, chiming in for many of these webinars and our discussions, and I think that is probably historically, but even more so over time. We live in a particular time where that's becoming more and more sacred. I have, and friends, and it's very clear.
Good. Individualism. Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Sage.
I just wanted to bring in the phrase normative adaptation, which I think is the counterpoint to Hank's kind of subconscious sacred values. If we think of normative adaptation, certainly it could be subconscious, but I think it's a useful term to distinguish between things that just are adaptive and things that we normatively wish to be adaptive. So that's certainly the lens with which I can imagine a group of people actually identifying what they collectively find is sacred and coming to some form of consensus. And of course, if they're wildly off off mark from each other, that's a separate discussion that would be interesting to discuss to get into. But I think there's an important point in thinking in evolutionary terms that people are often aversive to conscious direction of evolution. But of course, if we just define evolution simply as change over time by consequence, if we normatively decide that this is what we want and this is what we care about, then things that we do that bring us closer to those will actually be good consequences, outside of any other kind of utilitarian framework. So
that's really nice, Sage, and it's combined with Hank's observation before. So we often form our values subconsciously, right? We come to value and sacralize some things without, maybe just by osmosis, but we have the option of consciously revising those values and possibly arriving at values that serve us better in one way or another. Nice. Can I ask for clarification? Sorry, one quick clarification, Sage. If by a process of, say, reflection, we culturally modify our values, would that qualify as normative adaptation in the, or is normative adaptation more of a biological?
No, I do think that's exactly it. The idea of saying normative is to indicate like a form of conscious evaluation. You know, you're kind of subjectively deciding this is important amongst sort of arbitrarily equal values.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I do think that's actually that may be the big distinction if you're trying to cleave, you know, what humans can do in terms of adaptation.
Good. Thank you, Sage. Steve.
Well, I think we have to clarify what we mean by we. When you ask us, Andy, what do we hold sacred? Do we mean humanity on the planet? Or do we mean, you know, Western culture? Because, you know, I think one question is, all cultures sanctify, but are there some universals in what we sanctify? Because most things that I can think of we sanctify in Western culture. I'm not an anthropologist, but I imagine there's a culture somewhere that sanctifies the opposite. You know, David mentioned individualism. There are cultures that sanctify communalism more than individualism. I was thinking about, you know, different cultures' attitudes to how much money should be spent on someone 95 in an ICU. You know, all cultures sanctify human life, but not exactly in the same way. So, at the risk of sounding like Bill Clinton, you know, it depends on what you mean by is. The answer to your question depends on what you mean by we.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I guess I'm interested in examples of sacralization, no matter who the we is, just because it's an interesting phenomenon, whether it's all of us or even just some of us who are sacralizing. So really nice observation, I think. Velikovsky?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, just and thinking further there on Steve's point, who is the we? And thinking of sacred values, I'm just putting into the chat this new journal that's supposed to be starting this month. I guess, does everybody know about the Journal of Controversial Ideas?
Tell us about it.
Edited by Peter Singer, the ethical philosopher, and two other editors whose names escape me, sorry. But I see, for example, on the board of the journal is David Benatar, who's a very interesting philosopher, very contrary to a lot of people's ethical views. You may be familiar, everyone may be familiar with his approach. He wrote a book, or several books, one of which was called Better Never to Have Been Born. So he's an anti-natalist and considers that the amount of pleasure or received by being alive is outweighed by the amount of pain, sort of drawing back to Schopenhauer and these kind of philosophers. So I think David Benatar has had to be anonymous for most of his career and be careful about his identity, because to some, obviously, well, to probably most of us, it's a sacred value is human life is one sacred value as a generalization, I guess. And the rule of law was another one that kind of came to mind for me of two immediate sacred values that jump to mind. But I think there should be some interesting back and forth from that journal, because so many values and ethics that the vast populace finds beyond question are going to probably be questioned in the Journal of Controversial Ideas. So that will be an interesting forum to see which values are sacred and which maybe not.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah. The idea that rule of law is sacred or ought to be treated as sacred, it's a nice example, and I think we all probably think that that's true, at least to a degree. But And if you go along with that way of speaking, I mean, so most of us can think of laws that we think should be treated as inviolable, but we can also think of laws that, it's okay if you bend them from time to time as long as nobody gets hurt. Speed limits, maybe, for example. And if it's true that rules can be, or rule of law can be treated as to some degree sacred, then sacralization doesn't have to be an all or nothing thing. It can be a matter of degree, not a matter of kind, which is interesting. Yeah, Hank?
Well, I was thinking something more basic like sports teams, about universality. And since I've not studied sports teams a whole lot, I think there's something in there about going back, who knows how far back.
I know my own sports fandom verges on the irrational, and in ways that very parallel, I think, sort of religious
You
devotion.
beat up if you don't follow the rule when you're in the stadium,
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm wondering if people have thought about that as something that, well, some people, yeah, I'm sorry.
Perhaps a universal sacred value is your tribal identity.
Yeah.
Which that's what I see sports teams tapping into.
Nice. Thank you, Steve. That's great. Kathleen, jump in here.
Yeah, I'm a little confused about the difference between sacred value and other values here. And some of the things we've been talking about strike me as tendencies or values. But when you got to the tribal identity, I mean, I guess I feel like we're living in a culture where the idea of sacredness itself, like to treat something as sacred in a lot of contexts, is taboo, which almost makes it seem like it's sacred not to sacralize something.
Sort of our culture's become profane or anti-sacred in a certain way. Is that a fair gloss on?
Yeah, because I guess the idea of something being taboo, and so taboo that you can't even acknowledge why it's taboo. I mean, to me, that's getting closer to sacred than just, I mean, I know people feel very strongly about the Mets versus the Yankees, but it's just hard for me to see that as sacred.
It's as truly sacred. Yes. So I think the way Steve put it a minute ago, that tribal identity can be sacred. Another way to think about that is that our identities tend to form around values that we think of as essential or inviolable or sacred. I think maybe we're saying the same thing.
I'd just like to add that the word sacred, I think you said this at the outset, you say sacred, at least superficially, the first thing you might think of is some sort of religious belief. And I think that scientists in my view do hold something sacred, like the pursuit of truth and accuracy, at least in the community, not like I'll never tell a white lie, but in the process of doing science. Some scientists might object to that and say that I wouldn't call that sacred, but in my opinion, I think it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's probably true for a lot of scientists that we pursue the truth come what may, right? I mean, even if the truth might prove dangerous or unpleasant or upsetting, we pursue it and valorize it even anyway.
And that's not to say that religions don't value truth. That in large part, that's the huge part of overlap. They're pursuing truth as well.
Good. Yeah, Sage?
I guess there's one kind of angle to the idea of, when we talk about sacred values, I think it's natural to imagine that they have a tendency to fragment people into tribes, right? This idea of tribalism is sort of almost synonymous with incompatible sacred values. But I remember a paper I read just examining the social networks of people in contrast to their stated political views. And on the outset, while if you just look at people's views in politics and their values and what forms under them, it does seem like there's just these completely separate groups of people in many different ways, but that they're polarized and unconnected. But then if you ask people at the same token, like, who are they actually friends with, family with, coworkers with, you know, neighbors with, it suddenly is actually, the truth is that we're all completely reliant on social connections, that the differences of sacred values are not something that is fragmented. There might be, you know, barriers or create kind of uncomfortable situations, but none of us really, if this paper is to be believed, are living in bubbles that are actually isolated. We just, if we organize around our ideas, sure, we can find those kinds of groups, but we're also intermixed. That I almost want to kind of push back on the idea that in the societies we live in, that we end up in these sort of tribes. I think it's actually more of an abstraction that we do, and in the reality and I kind of almost wanted to discuss what it means to coexist with each other when our sacred values are just all over the place.
Wow, really interesting, Sage. I'm reminded of an argument made by Daniel Dennett and I think Jaron Lanier. They basically pointed out that in a highly information technology networked world, it's extremely hard to create an impermeable information barrier where sacred values can't be challenged, or where people can't raise objections to treating something as always overriding, right? As you become aware of how complex the world is and how a sacred value might serve you well within a certain domain, but not so well if you extend it beyond that domain, it becomes harder and harder to sort of maintain your devotion to those values. And so arguably the internet is eroding sacred values with a tip of the hat to what Kathleen was saying before. Yeah, Hank?
Well, I was looking at Scott Atran's work again, and he deals mostly with the Middle East and the terrorists around the world for the last 30, 40 years or whatever. But I was thinking about, I think I'm inferring from what he's saying, that you've got to be willing to, not willing, it's given that you'll give up your life or whatever. There's nothing more important than this transcendental notion. And I'm not sure anybody's going to do that for science, or they might have done here and there, but it's that's the criteria that I'm using now. I mean, it's an extreme, but if we think of on a continuum, one is giving up your life, but how much harm are you going to do another to maintain it, or how much harm are you going to do to yourself? So I'm just focused right now, after reviewing that again, on that aspect to help me determine, like the Crusades, was a group thing. Well, they did a lot of harm, a lot of groups are doing a lot of harm. They're not just find something really important and they'll, okay.
And at the same time, I have no doubt that many crusaders found a sense of meaning and purpose and maybe passionate fulfillment that they might have lacked in their lives were it not for a crusade. But it's
that transcendental, counterintuitive to some.
Yeah.
That is the mark of what at least Atran and some of the others I've read in your suggestions.
Yes.
So that's where I am.
Thank you, Hank. That's great. David. You need you to unmute, bottom left.
There we go. Sorry. So there's one thing that I thought of immediately in terms of sacred values that hasn't been discussed, and that would be oneness. So I'll just do a little sort of connection why I think that should feature there. So the sacred is unknown. We can't measure the sacred necessarily, but we do relate it to spirituality, to our spirit. Also, we can't measure spirit. And this brings us back to consciousness, which was raised earlier. So we don't really know where consciousness resides or really how it functions other than some sort of neurological kinds of
Uh-huh.
triggers. But so where does this oneness come from?
Mm.
My belief is that it is our original gene. That when Lucy was running across the savannah of Africa, she was at one with nature. And then we mythologically sacralized this oneness.
Hmm.
And that translated into the creation myths that we used and in all cultures, and that oneness is
Mhm.
something that we lost when we made the evolutionary transition to like rational man.
Interesting. Thank you, David, for sharing. That's some fascinating connections there. I want to throw another provocation into the work here. How many of you are married or have been married or expect to be married? Okay, let me ask you this. Do you want your spouse, or would you want your spouse to treat marital fidelity as sacred? I see Steve going, yep, he's nodding.
Well, that's kind of a no-brainer, right? Male Homo sapien, mama's baby and papa's maybe, and all of that kind of stuff that, from David Buss. So that was my reaction to that.
And I guess in connection with that, think about how many religions put a very high value on sexual purity, at least among women, right? And sort of enforce norms of abstinence until marriage, at least, and treat that almost as a sacred obligation to the deity or something. I wonder if we can connect this at all with cancel culture. So just in the last week or so, the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins posted a highly provocative tweet where he compared Rachel Dolezal's choice to identify as Black, even though her parentage was white, to a transgender person's choice to transition from male to female or vice versa. And by juxtaposing these two choices to identify as something else, and then pointing out how easy it is to be, well, and he basically raised the question, why is it that the progressive left thinks it's almost sacred, that each and every one of us has an almost sacred obligation to acknowledge and validate a person's decision to undergo a gender transition. But we deny that same privilege when it comes to identifying with a different race in the case of Rachel Dolezal. And this tweet raised a huge firestorm of people accusing Dawkins of insensitivity to transgender people. Many secular groups that I've been associated with, rushed to condemn Dawkins for this tweet. And it made me wonder whether the desire to be sensitive to the concerns of, say, transgender people has become an almost sacred value among young people today. So that the need to be sensitive to the plight of historically disadvantaged classes has become, I think, in some ways, almost a sacred obligation on behalf of many young progressives. And when an older person from another generation like Dawkins comes along and says, wait a second here, guys, when we start to sacralize things willy-nilly and don't think about consistency, some kooky things happen. I was reminded of this when one of the links I provided to in the prompt mentioned that there's now some research indicating that people form their religious or sacred or their identities often during adolescence. So if you belong to a church during adolescence, you're likely to maintain that religious identity through much of your life. But if you grow up in a culture that sacralizes, I don't know, identity politics or sensitivity to the underprivileged, perhaps you will end up with a set of sacred values that will stay with you for the rest of your life. Yeah, Hank.
Yeah, just, I'd like to just remind us that we're also talking about alliances from the, back to the 10,000 years ago, how that shapes our brain. And so some of these sacred values have to do with which team am I going to be on, you know, which scientific team. And so I don't know much about Dawkins. Maybe you guys know a lot more, but I'm not sure what his shtick is, you know, or what, is he counter anybody's alliance? So he's got something he's not going to let go of. I mean, he won't kill for it or die. So I'm not sure what, you know, it's not just a statement or that people are going to react to, but what's his thing, you know?
I can offer a little bit of insight on that. I think Dawkins, as a biologist, and an evolutionary biologist who knows how deep sex differences run in the animal kingdom, right? I mean, many animals reproduce sexually, which means there are male and female versions of those species. And when culture warriors say, forget about sex, let's talk about gender instead. And gender is fluid and gender is a choice, right? And we need to honor that choice. And Dawkins kind of gets his back up sometimes and saying, hey guys, there's biology is involved here too. And when he does that, I think he often raises the ire of people who are pushing for better treatment of transgender people, bisexual people on the gender spectrum elsewhere. That's the short version.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Kathleen.
Well, permit me to get a little personal here. I'm thinking of my own virtual excommunication from the Women's Studies program at Vassar. That occurred around the time I had given a talk I can't remember now, 14 years ago, called Evolutionary Psychology and Women's Studies, What Can They Bring to Each Other? And I made the suggestion that there was not a purely cultural reason for male preference for women who are not menopausal. I mean, that was one of the things I was trying to explain. And I mean, it was like an excommunication. It really was. But there are two things going on here. One is I really felt the sacredness had to do with a group trying to protect its identity, that tribal identity. And then the other thing to do with Dawkins is, well, you know, if free speech is a value, then at one time, I really thought it was a sacred value almost for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you should be able to express your truth seeking, but then you have to put up with people disagreeing with you and even being angry. It's just that the way these conversations, it's almost as if the fight is over what is going to be sacred, not what is true, but what's going to be sacred.
Not only do you not need to ask for forgiveness to share a personal story like that, I think it's really a powerful story. And thank you very much for sharing that. Steve?
When you were sharing that story, Andy, I think that the sacred value among the progressive left that you're describing is the following: thou shalt not hurt anyone's feelings ever. And the book that comes to mind, and it came to mind, Kathleen, as you were describing what happened to you at Vassar, is a book by Jonathan Rauch, R-A-U-C-H, called Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought. And that book is 20 years old, but has been just issued by U Chicago Press in a new edition. And he identifies, and I think the clash here is, and the clash in the Dawkins tweet and the clash that happened to you, Kathleen, is the clash between the sacredness of the pursuit of truth and this new value of thou shalt not hurt anybody's feelings ever. And what Rauch does in that book is he identifies several threats to free thought and free speech, and one of which he calls the humanitarian threat. And that's the threat of thou shalt never hurt anybody's feelings. He also identifies one called the egalitarian threat, which is that everybody's opinion is equally valid. And there are several other threats he identifies, but it's an excellent book and I recommend it most highly.
Thank you for that. I've recently come across an article or two of Jonathan Rauch's, and he's very, very good. So I'll second Steve's recommendation. So a friend of mine wrote either a book or a post, or some kind of blog post many years ago, titled "I Sold My Soul on eBay." In fact, he actually did that. He went onto eBay and he sold his soul. And then he, created a very nice little following for himself online. And he now bills himself as the friendly atheist. And he blogs on Patheos, which is a place where people go to discuss questions related to religion and so on. I think part of what makes the title, "I Sold My Soul on eBay," kind of part of what grips us about that title is that it's just a clear example of taking something that's supposed to be treated as sacred and saying, hey, I sold it for a price. Not only that, I did it in a forum where people sell stuff on a whim, right? So it's, if nothing else, that title is a provocation to think about, what we treat as sacred and, whether it's a good idea to treat things like our souls as sacred. I would say, so I guess I don't believe I have a soul, so I'm not particularly offended by this guy. His name is Hemant Mehta. Not particularly offended that he chose to, quote, sell his soul. And yet, I do place a high value on integrity. And for many people, soul is kind of just a metaphor for one's personal integrity. And so the idea that you might sell your integrity for a certain price on eBay, I do find that a little bit offensive, interestingly enough. Yeah, Hank, jump in.
Well, I'm going back to Scott Atran, and I think I'm inferring what he said, but he said something like that human nature, that it doesn't exist. It's too variable, it's too complicated, but so human nature, it's not a sacred value that I'm going to kill you if you say there's no human nature, and I say there is, and we'll get into a battle with you. But there's something about these constructs, even in the, whatever we call this, the social sciences. Is biology talk about human nature? Anybody? I'm not clear, but yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, actually, that's a wonderful question. So I think when I was in college back in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, the idea that human beings have a certain biological nature was viewed as oppressive because it basically deterred people from actually exploring the limits of possibility, right? So if you accept that something's just natural, a lot of times people will go, oh, well, I guess you can't change that. It's just human nature. So at least the view on the left was often that the whole idea that we have a human nature is a bad idea. And so philosophers like Michel Foucault made a name for himself by just arguing that there is no such thing as human nature. Now, biologists like Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker, and especially argue that evolution has in fact implanted certain very distinct tendencies within us, and that, and to that extent, human nature exists and is real. It doesn't mean it's always unmodifiable,
Right, but the usually the superficial is human nature. Is it evil or is it good? Or, you know, at that good and bad level is what I'm talking about. And that's, I think he's suggesting these are not sacred values, but constructs, and they're a team.
Mhm.
You know, Catholic Church, some used to say, or Judeo-Christian, we're evil, and you gotta take care of that forever. So, or I forget his name, but anyways, but the whole business about are we like chimpanzees? Are we like the bonobos? That kind of dialogue that goes on around amongst scientists as well.
Mm. Mhm.
So I don't know if people want to.
Yeah, and I've recommended this book in past episodes of Examined Lives, but Rutger Bregman's book, Humankind, it's a brilliant argument that human beings are, in fact, a great deal more benevolent and kind-hearted than is commonly acknowledged. And some wonderful, he draws from some wonderful evidence in biology, history, sociology to make that case.
You know, Damasio tries to address that too in some of his earlier books. I don't know how far he gets, but he's trying to say it's not that we're all evil like the chimpanzees, but we have some kindness in us too. And let's take advantage of it, which is not saying we're kind or evil, it's just contextual as well.
I want to throw another interesting connection into the works. One of the 4 articles I linked to as for suggested background reading talks about the way in which values thought to be sacred can come into conflict, leading to tragic choices. Like no matter which way you choose, you're having to violate a sacred value, and it often ends tragically. This gives me a new interpretation of the art form of Greek tragedy. And I wonder if the following hypothesis strikes any of you as reasonable. I mean, the ancient Greek culture lived through some really turbulent times where tribal passions, tore Athens apart and reassembled it. And I think that some of the leading thinkers, tragedians, and playwrights, tragedians like Sophocles and Aristophanes, they were aware of how dangerous sacred values can become when you cling to them uncritically or without any inclination to acknowledge that even the most sacred values have to give way sometimes. So I wonder whether the art form of Greek tragedy isn't sort of designed to kind of provoke the passions that help you acknowledge more deeply how dangerous it can become to treat anything as sacred full stop or sacred without exception. Does anybody know enough about Greek tragedy or whatever to shed any light on whether that hypothesis has merit?
I think it to me brings mind to your earlier point, the idea that sacred values have to be insulated, and if you find yourself in various contexts where they're no longer seen as sacred, you either have to fight against that, or you have to kind of adapt how strongly you wish to hold those values in that instance. And it seems that when we're talking about within the academy and perhaps the ways that more like political sacred values are being held by people who are in contexts where maybe they are doing some, they're holding to the values over perhaps other responsibilities that they may have in that context. And again, that would be the first option, continuing to hold those values and actually trying to reshape the context so that it represents a harmonious place for those values, as opposed to saying, this is a separate context and we have to disassociate in some way.
Yeah, and of course in American party politics, it often helps to run in the primary on your tribe's sacred values. and then tack to the middle and try to win over enough middle of the road or independents to win a general election. I think America's founders are reportedly to have been very worried about factionalism pulling America apart. And in our own time, we're sort of seeing how parties are rallying around the values sacred to them and refusing to compromise sort of across the aisle. And it's certainly tearing at the social fabric of America. I know we have non-Americans here, but that's an example that springs to my mind. So guys, we're down to like the last 5 or 6. Actually, I want to hear from Kathleen, and then we're going to vote on a topic for next month.
I just wanted to make the point. I mean, I'm in languages, and the role of language is so critical. You can talk about a value, but it's how you frame the value in language that can make the difference between people even knowing what they're talking about. If you talk about freedom, and we know how that word is, or feminism. Basically, I had a view of feminism that was viewed as unfeminist because, so the language has so much to do with it, and the unconscious effects of language, even on people like Dawkins, who might think that they grasp things without even being aware of the way metaphors affect our thinking. He even admits he should have called his book The Immortal Gene and not The Selfish Gene, for good reasons.
Nice. And Kathleen, I just want you to know that you will never be excommunicated from Examined Lives. So you're safe to explore the boundaries of your feminism here. I think you'll find.
I don't mind if you get angry and disagree with me. Just don't cancel me.
Yeah, I hear you, and I feel the same way. Wow, a lot of nice observations today, guys. Thank you. So as always, we're going to collectively choose our topic for next month. I brought 3 with me that I'm going to suggest, and we can usually take take nominations from maybe one nomination from the floor as well. Then we'll vote. So topic number 1, I'll walk through each of the 3 of them and then ask you to use your reactions button, say the hand raising widget under your reactions button, to vote for the ones. You can vote for as many as you like. Top vote getter will be our topic for next month. Then Sage, I believe, usually does the counting. Thank you, Sage. Okay, topic number 1, norms. What are they? Where do they come from? How do they evolve? How